Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Live from New York City, this is Wisdom the Sages, your daily yoga podcast. Today, I am your host, Kaustubha Das. My co-host, Raghunath, is in the holy place of Jagannath Puri on the beach at the foot of the hill where Krishna resides as Jagannath for thousands of years. He's with a group of about 48 of our Wisdom the Sages listeners, including our favorite, I want to say co-host. What do we call your position? I mean, we say executive producer, so we'll just stay there. Executive producer, Mara. Mara's got a very weak connection over there. Mara, can you say hello?
Hey, I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yeah, we hear you. That's pretty better than I was expecting. Okay. Yeah. How are you settling in, Mara? How's everybody doing?
Great group here. We're all super excited to be here. We just arrived.
Oh man, it's been so long since I've been to Jagannath Puri. It's like my heart is like feeling an unusual blend of emotions right now. I wish I could be there with you. Soon you will be honoring the prasadam of Lord Jagannath. It comes in these little baskets, you know. Yeah, and you will eat it, and you will when you eat that, you've acquired so much devotional punya, so much devotional credit. I believe that when you eat that, you're going to feel a deep ecstasy that you never felt before.
I can't wait. I'm excited.
Oh, and you're a cook, so you should do this. Although you can't get into the temple, you can go across the street to the library, and you go up on the roof, and you can look down and see. I believe the world's largest kitchen is in Jagannath Puri. You look down on that kitchen, and there's like hundreds of cooks in there. Yeah, there's hundreds of cooks, and they cook in this way that they only use clay pots, and like they put all the ingredients in the pot, and they don't do anything to it, but then they cook it, and the whole town is running on that prasadam. They're like pumping it out, like huge pots are coming out with tons and tons of food all day. You are about to honor Lord Jagannath's prasadam, the #1 caterer in Columbia County. How does that feel?
I'm looking forward to it. So
can
excited.
You do me a favor? Can you bring me back just a little,
yes, Prabhu.
Just a little speck, any just little tiny speck? I just need something.
You got it. Whatever you like, Prabhu.
All right. We have a wonderful guest today, but before we get to our wonderful guests, I just want to check in. What announcements do you have, Mara?
We have a Bhakti Recovery Group meeting at 9:30 today, and our show will be at 8 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow also. Probably all week.
Probably all week, but although we're going to ask people to be a little bit more flexible, people tuning in on Zoom, because you never know what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you going to stick with us, or are you going to have to move on, Mary?
I'm going to try and stick with you, although
but you may be moving.
Pretty unstable internet connection here at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you for pulling this together. I know you just arrived, so I appreciate you getting us started. Because we're kind of hopeless without you, Mary. I don't know if you know that. She does. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mary. Now today, we're mentioning in the shows building up to this, we have a very special guest. Professor Ravi Gupta, also known as Radhika Ramana Prabhu, is here with us today. Prabhu, thank you so much for joining us today on our show.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been anticipating this for days now.
Okay, great. We have to. And I'll just share a little bit of your bio with people that Dr. Ravi M. Gupta, or Radhika Ramana Das, is a Charles Reed Professor of Religious Studies and Department Head for History, Religious Studies, and Classics at Utah State University. He is the author or editor of 4 books, including an abridged translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam with Kenneth Valpey, published in 2017 on Columbia University Press. And Ravi has received 4 teaching awards, the National Endowment for Humanities Summer Fellowship, 3 research fellowships, and a book award. And he is a permanent research fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and a past president for the Society of Hindu Christian Studies. He speaks around the world on topics related to Chaitanya Vaishnavism, Vedanta philosophy, and Krishna bhakti traditions. And uh, let me refer to you in your by your initiated name, Radhika Ramana Prabhu. But you were educated at home by your parents, correct?
Yeah, that's right. My mother homeschooled me until the age of 13.
She must have done a really good job. But she did it in a unique way, from what I understand.
Yeah, it was a curriculum based on Srimad Bhagavatam, actually, and study of Sanskrit. And so we did our math, of course, through a series called Saxon Math Books, and then the rest of it was all language arts, from reading, writing, spelling, English. All of that was from Srimad Bhagavatam.
Right, and she created the curriculum herself?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was very flexible and free flowing. So maybe curriculum suggests too much structure.
But you read Bhagavatam together.
Exactly.
And you learned everything you needed to learn to become to graduate from Oxford through that, or at least built you up for that. That's really amazing. I would love to meet your mother someday and hear more about her, how she did that. But that's
She's amazing. She's wonderful.
So now your thesis, I believe, was on Jiva Goswami. Is that correct?
Right.
Who's such an important figure in the lineage that Raghunath and I present here, which is the Gaudiya Vaishnava lineage or the Chaitanya Vaishnavism lineage. Could you just speak a bit about that? And what I would really like to take this conversation towards the Srimad Bhagavatam, which we read daily. But maybe you can mention something about your thesis, who Jiva Goswami or who the six Goswamis were, and how that ties into Srimad Bhagavatam.
Yeah, so that was Jiva Goswami lived in the 16th century and was kind of the generation right after Sri Chaitanya, and as the second generation, the generation coming after the charismatic founder of a tradition. So, Sri Chaitanya, in his biographies describe him as extremely charismatic and very influential in the way that he encountered people and inspired them in bhakti. But imagine the generation after that, when that charismatic leader is gone, and you need to now figure out how to keep that going, to keep that inspiration going. And Jiva Goswami was that person who kind of took it upon himself to ensure that the tradition continues in all its vibrancy, both philosophically. So he was a prolific author. His work is estimated at 1 million Sanskrit verses, or the equivalent of that.
My goodness.
I've actually, no, 1 million of the six Goswamis together, 400,000 for himself, which is 4 times the size of the largest book in the world, the Mahabharata. So it's a huge output, and that included philosophical writings. It included poetic, literary material. It included ritual manuals. It included manuals on grammar. So extremely versatile and deep writer. But he was also crucial in terms of leadership and management and legal issues for the tradition in that generation, when again you needed to put everything in place. And so in many ways, the fact that we have access to the tradition here, or that we're on this podcast here today, that we're able to talk about this lineage, is thanks to him, because that generation right after the founding, that's one of the toughest times to be part of a spiritual tradition.
And in presenting this tradition, it wasn't that it was isolated, but he's presenting a tradition within a broader tradition of Vedanta, right?
Yes, exactly. That was part of his job, was to kind of connect our tradition to that broader world of Vedanta.
Okay, and in other words, in one sense, it's maybe the word can be a little misleading, but in a sense, it's almost like he's defending the tradition, like presenting it, but showing how it's authentic and how it is part of that broader more ancient tradition.
Yes, exactly.
And one important part of what he's doing that is establishing the unique role or the unique position of the Srimad Bhagavatam, of this particular text.
Yeah, so in terms of that prolific output that he did, his more or less, I would say the most of what he wrote was all an attempt to show his readers just how brilliant and wonderful is this book, Srimad Bhagavatam. And his magnum opus, the six Sandarbhas, it's a book with 6 parts to it, is basically a weaving together of different verses and elements of the Bhagavatam in a way that is thematically coherent. The Bhagavatam structure is like a conversation. It kind of wanders, but he kind of puts it together in a way that's philosophically consistent. And that's his main contribution. That was his magnum opus, was to basically open the blinds for us in terms of the Srimad Bhagavatam and show his readers that it's all there.
And so could you share with us what is unique about Srimad Bhagavatam? It's coming from a tradition of Vedanta that has vast literatures. It's coming from the works of one sage, Srila Vyasadeva, who compiled the 4 Vedas, which maybe you can tell me. I don't know how many verses there are in the 4 Vedas.
Yeah, so I mean, the uniqueness of the Bhagavatam can be, its special qualities can be talked about from many different perspectives. And I think our listeners here today and yourself, Kaustubha, are quite familiar with its power to impact us personally in our lives and transform us spiritually and emotionally and in terms of our character. But if just because I'm a professor, if we take a step back for a second and just look at the text historically, not really from a personal experience or faith perspective, we still find that the Bhagavatam is extraordinary. And it helps us understand why generations, a millennia of people have, very wise people have found so much in this work. So the Bhagavatam is extraordinary on kind of it's combination of philosophy and literature. So most works of philosophy are not very fun to read, right? If you
Sure.
they're tough and they've got arguments, and it's not the type of thing you want to read before bed unless you're trying to fall asleep. In contrast, works that are literature, poetry, and so on, our stories are typically not very philosophically systematic. They suggest ideas to the reader, they drop things here and there, but they're really more to evoke certain kinds of emotions and relationships and connect.
Rather than precision and clear arguments and so on.
Exactly. Okay. What sets the Bhagavatam apart is that it does both of these things, and it does it very successfully. And what I mean by successfully is that people who do philosophy, that's all they do. They study the Bhagavatam for its philosophical import. And those who do literature, and that's all they do, poetry and so on, they study the Bhagavatam for poetic quality. And so you can kind of tell that if specialists in both areas are turning to the Bhagavatam, it's a fine work of literature combined with a fine work of philosophy. And that's one of the things that makes it really special.
Reading the English translation, we can pick up on the story and we can pick up on the philosophy, although perhaps certain subtleties are lost in translation. But I often wonder just how much I'm missing out on in terms of poetry or just, I suppose, poetic impact, or like emotional impact through it. But as a person that reads Sanskrit, you can be honest with me, like, how much am I missing out on here?
It's a lot. I'm sorry to say it's a lot, Prabhu. It's I mean, there have been times when I just recite the verses just for their beauty, without attempting to use intellectual capacities to pull them apart and explain, just immersing yourself in the beauty of the sound, but also the things like alliteration, ideas, the way they're sprinkled through a verse, the way certain sounds are repeated. I know one verse, when I was translating it, I had to give a footnote, like a thick paragraph long, to try to explain why a particular word was being used and how it reflected off other words in that same verse, to create this beautiful tapestry of language that was just impossible to put into English. I mean, it's the same way in the other direction, right? If we took a fine piece of English poetry and tried to put it in Sanskrit, you would lose so much. It's just the nature of translation in both directions. It's not saying something good or bad about a language, but saying so much is gained, but also lost in the process of translation. And just, to put some numbers to this, most Sanskrit Puranas, the genre in which the Bhagavatam exists, most Puranas use like 2 or 3 or 4 verse meters, so metrical patterns to sing or to pattern the verses.
The poetic forms of the verses.
Exactly. Like Shakespeare's iambic pentameter, for example, to be or not to be, that is the question. There's a rhythm to it. And whether or not we know what iambic pentameter is, we feel it as human beings. We are hardwired to pick up rhythm.
It moves
this is why
in one way or another.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so the Bhagavatam, it is so most Puranas use like 3 or 4 meters. The Bhagavatam uses dozens. I think it's like 33. I can't remember the exact number, but it's dozens of meters. And some meters are found uniquely in Bhagavatam or rarely elsewhere before the Bhagavatam. So it's just in terms of, metrical patterns, or we could take many different measures of what it means to have good poetry, but the Bhagavatam stands out.
And from what I've heard, Jiva Goswami, along with his other Goswamis, the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan, they would gather at Jiva's place of residence, the Radha Damodar temple, and read Bhagavatam like in many different, read the same verses in many different melodies. Is that how it was? Like they were.
Yes, many different melodies for appreciating the flavor of it, and then many different explanations. These commentaries by these sages that you're describing, the 6 Goswamis, I mean, they will often provide more than one, like 2 interpretations, 3, 4, sometimes up to 5 different explanations on a single verse in the commentary, trying to pull out what's there. So it's really like a well that you keep drawing water from, and it kind of never empties out.
Amazing. So now, but so okay, I'm missing out on a lot. No question. My fault for not learning Sanskrit. But let's I would love to hear from you about its place, the Srimad Bhagavatam's place. I say within Vedanta, but maybe to our listeners, it's maybe more meaningful for me to say within the yoga tradition, that how the Srimad Bhagavatam, I feel it's real important because I think we're in like this postmodern world. There's a kind of a backlash, and in many ways a justified backlash towards what people refer to nowadays as religion. I think even the word has changed a lot, even in my own lifetime, of what we mean when we say religion, of what that word, the connotations within the word. But the Srimad Bhagavatam, to me, it's presenting a lot of fascinating ideas that are counter to some of the ideas that were presented earlier in the yoga tradition, even by the same author, Vyasadeva. That it's presenting something that's more evolved, or let's say it's something that is revealing where this is all meant to go, like rather than being a step towards where it's meant to go, like finally like opening it all up and saying, this is where the whole yoga path leads. And in doing so, it presents some scenarios and stories and teachings that are very different than what we've heard before. Could you speak to that a bit, please?
Yeah, that's a great thought, and I think we see what you're describing very well if we look at the trajectory of literature coming before the Bhagavatam, where you have many of the same leelas, same pastimes being depicted, the same narratives, but you see the difference in the way the Bhagavatam does it. And that
Same
difference,
stories, but looking at them through a different lens.
yeah, and that difference can be encapsulated very simply, which is that the earlier texts are focused primarily on the plot and the Lord, the deity, the Lord's incarnation or form as he appears, right? So that's kind of the focus, the drama and who's on the top of that drama, right? So it's a very kind of hierarchical sort of, let's establish dharma, righteousness, harmony in the world. And it's wonderful. I mean, it has a feel to it of rising higher and upward. So I don't want to put that down, but at the same time, when the Bhagavatam takes those same stories, the Bhagavatam says, hold on, we want to focus on something different. And the focus on the Bhagavatam is all about the relationships that are present there, right? The connections between the characters, and especially the devotees, the human characters there, and how they are experiencing the situation and how they are relating to both each other and to divinity, right? So the focus becomes much more, horizontal. It becomes more approachable. And I think that's what makes the Bhagavatam special, is that we can find our own story in those stories of great sages and heroes and leaders from thousands of years ago. We can still see ourselves there. And that's what allows the Bhagavatam to speak to us in a way that I think other texts sometimes don't, right? Is it really hits the mark there in terms of relationship.
What you're saying is interesting to me, because something that I've found, and Raghunath and I have discussed this, he's also found this in his own life, is when we began this practice and were first exposed to Bhagavatam, we would find interest in the stories and in the plot, and in the, I suppose, morals or the lessons that were being presented there, let's say on that surface level through the plot. But commonly in Bhagavatam, at a certain point, it opens up and prayers are offered. And those prayers, to some degree, they were almost like, okay, let's get past this and let's get on to the next story, or let's get back into the plot. Let's dig back into the story. And as we've kind of hopefully grown and matured a little bit, we tend to almost feel like the plot is just setting up this. It's kind of like almost the purpose to the plot was just where that person begins to speak of their relationship and begins to it's kind of like the whole thing was framing this right here, where we get to go into the mind and the heart of a particular bhakti yogi, and see how they think and maybe even more importantly how they feel in the relationship with either with the deity, with Krishna or Vishnu, or with other devotees.
Yeah, I really appreciate that experience of yours, because I experienced something similar as reading Bhagavatam as a child, and it was for kids and especially for little boys, it's like let's get to the fight scenes, and let's keep when does Nrsingadev fight with Hiranyakashipu, when does the Lord fight with the demon, and what happens, and then all of the blood and the gore, and that was what was exciting, and it was, as you said, kind of very much let's get through the prayers as quickly as we can so we get back to the plot. And it's over years of reading, recognizing actually those prayers are where it's at. That's where you see the relationship that that devotee shares with the Lord and with others in the scene. And every prayer, there's no generic prayer in the Bhagavatam. Every prayer is distinctive, it's individual, and you can hear all the joy and all the pain of their life and their experience coming through those words. It's like them opening their hearts up and saying, you're welcome to look inside. And that's a real privilege, you know, to be able to look inside and see what's happening there. So, you know, someone like Prahlad, for example, a little boy who's been through so much with his father torturing him, he's offering us a look inside as to what that means in his own experience through the multiple prayers that he offers in that story.
Well, that it's such a fascinating story. The story of, generally people would say the story of Nrsimhadeva, you know, the story of Lord Vishnu taking this particularly fascinating form as a half man, half lion. It's very popular all over India. It's obviously got a lot of, as you're saying, it's got some blood, it's got some gore, it's got some, you know, it's got some battle going on. But really, when you look more carefully at that story, Lord Nrsimhadev says how many, do you know offhand how many chapters of the seventh canto that
I think it's 6 or 7 chapters. It's one of the longest running stories in the entire Bhagavatam.
And perhaps Lord Nrsimhadev speaks only in one of those chapters, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's one. Yep.
So
maybe two.
It's really the story of Prahlad. It's really his story. A boy, 7 years old, or a very young boy, and his thoughts and his realizations, and getting back to what we were mentioning earlier, that the Bhagavatam is kind of, we could say, responding to, or kind of like, let's say, a further development, a further evolution of these yogic teachings, where in some ways it's almost countering some of the ideas, some of the traditional ideas, some of the religious ideas that have been established. And you've used the term Dharmic reversals. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak to that in, let's say, in relation to the story. And maybe I could just like encapsulate the story, because we haven't gotten there in our own reading on Wisdom of the Sages yet. But maybe I could just briefly tell that story, very briefly tell that story, just so that people understand it. And the idea was that there's a demonic figure, Hiranyakashipu, who's he's challenged the devas who are responsible for maintaining dharma and peace in the universe. They've been challenged by this figure who's adharmic, who's egocentric, and with great intensity. And through his own mystic yoga practices, he's become more powerful. And his son is Prahlad. Prahlad is born in the dynasty of these demonic figures, and it's expected that he will follow in their footsteps. So the story develops into a conflict between father and son, father of a very demonic nature, and Prahlad, who in the womb of his mother, a great devotee, a great bhakti yogi, has spoken to her, and through her to him, and infused him with feelings of devotion, which develops this conflict. And maybe you can take it from there and share some insights about Dharmic reversals, or any other insights that you have from it. Oh, we can't hear you, Prabhu. I think you may have muted yourself, or do I need to unmute you?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize if I muted myself, I wouldn't be able to unmute. So I apologize. I had a little cough there. So this story, thank you for summarizing it. I mean, I think this story is a great example of our, what we were saying earlier about the Bhagavatam's uniqueness, where every prior text, it's a very old story that you know, every Purana describes in some way or another. But when the Bhagavatam does it, every Purana puts Nrsimhadev, the Lord in this half man, half lion form, at the center of the story. He's the hero. But the Bhagavatam is the first to say, actually, it's Prahlad who's the hero. It's this little boy who is struggling under these incredibly difficult circumstances with his father in a very difficult environment. He's the real hero of the story. And that's why you see this, 5 chapters to Prahlad, 2 to Nrsimha, that kind of ratio taking place. But I think what's also important about the story is this point of dharmic reversals, that the Bhagavatam so often takes people who would normally be at the bottom of a social hierarchy and puts them at the top. Not just randomly, but for a specific reason, which is to show that really it's bhakti that supersedes everything else, right? So if there's bhakti there, if someone has bhakti in their heart, they've got purity of heart and devotion, then that is more important to the Lord, and it's more important to the world than whatever their social hierarchy might be. So the Bhagavatam is a work where, where people of lower castes end up teaching those of upper castes, where women teach their husbands, and where little children teach their fathers, and where animals teach human beings, right? Every one of these, there's multiple stories connected to them. And each one of them, from a, whether you look at it in a contemporary perspective or from a historical one, right? Typically, these are hierarchical situations where the lower castes can approach the upper ones, and children are lesser than their parents, and there's these humans are so much better than animals. But the Bhagavatam says, no, hold on. What makes someone better or worse is not about our physical bodies. It's not about our birth. It's not about all these designations. That what really matters to the Lord is the quality of our heart. Where's bhakti at? And so there's these reversals, these dharmic reversals, meaning reversals of the social structure, with the clear idea of saying, look, bhakti trumps everything, right? Bhakti supersedes everything. Doesn't matter what so-called shortcomings you might have in the eyes of the world. If you have bhakti, you have it all. And Prahlad is a fine example of that. He's a little boy, right? That's one shortcoming. What do kids know? 5, 7-year-old kids, they don't know anything, says the world, right? And then he's the son of a demon, means that he
from a bad family.
comes from a really bad family. I mean, from a Vedic perspective, this is like lower than human. These are people who live for the express purpose of exploiting the world. And he comes in that family, right? So he's the son of the most frightening demon that the world has known up to that point. And the world quakes in Hiranyakashipu's presence. The gods, human beings, the earth, those lower, everyone trembles in Hiranyakashipu's presence. And Prahlad is born into that family, right? So I think it's a really good example of that kind of role reversal, and especially endearing because Prahlad is just a child, and he's going through so much, something no child should go through.
Now, on the chat board, we're getting some really important questions, and I want to get to them actually. And I think they're all going to fit into this idea of, or I believe you could speak to it in the context of dharmic reversals. But just for the moment, sticking with Prahlad's theme. So what is it that we hear in this dharmic reversal from Prahlad?
Yeah.
What's taught? What does he teach?
So in order to appreciate that, I think we need to recognize that the context of the family that he's born in. So Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha, 2 brothers who've specialized in terrorizing the world, right? They're rulers. They do this extremely well, and they're frightening and giving pain to all creatures. And so Vishnu, the Lord, is thinking, okay, I need to deal with them. And the earth itself is calling out to him and saying, please help. So he comes and he kills Hiranyaksha, one of the 2 brothers. And Hiranyakashipu, Prahlad's father, the other brother, is left behind, and his heart is filled with revenge. Right? This is his, after Hiranyaksha's death, this is his like driving force in life, that he's going to get revenge for the death of his brother, and he's going to kill Vishnu. I mean, you can kind of imagine a family that has gone through that kind of, trauma, that kind of pain, and how that's going to transform everything, right? This is probably everything they ever talk about. And they've got their hopes pinned on Prahlad. This young boy, the next generation, he's the one who's going to grow up, become a really mean fighter, and he's gonna kill Vishnu, and he's gonna bring back the family's honor. And we know how this happens, right? Over generations,
certainly,
that sort of revenge carries through, and it permeates the psychology of a family over multiple generations. And Prahlad could, I mean, that was the easy thing to do, right? He could have like fit right into that and kind of go right through. And what we see as Prahlad's strength in the story is his refusal to buy into that worldview, to say that, no, I am not going to seek revenge. I'm going to respond with compassion. And his father's speeches about how Vishnu's our enemy, Vishnu needs to be killed, et cetera, and Prahlad returning to that and saying, Father, I think you have it wrong. There is no enemy and there is no friend. This bifurcation, this polarity that you've created in the world, that's a creation of your own mind. It doesn't exist out there, because the Lord is everyone's friend. And I want to tell you that he's yours too. That everything you're doing today, even your attempt to seek revenge, the power for that comes from the very person you're trying to seek revenge, right? So you have to recognize that he's everyone's friend. And his refusal to buy into those categories was the most courageous thing that you could do in that circumstance. He was speaking truth to power, right? Even as a 7-year-old boy, that was his kind of contribution. And so sometimes when you read the story, you can think Prahlad is passive. His father, eventually, he comes to the point of, he kind of descends into this hellish mode of thinking and says, okay, anyone who's not with me is my enemy. Everyone who's not for me is against me. And he takes that to the extent where he's ready to kill Prahlad and to torture him. And he does. He tries over and over again. He puts Prahlad into these horrific circumstances of trying to throw him off a cliff or put him in a pit of snakes to try to prove that he's the boss. And this is a mode of person that we've seen in our world, right? That we've seen plenty of tyrants who work with this operation, this idea that as long as you're with me, you will be protected and cared for, and nothing can touch you, not even a hair on your head. But if you turn against me, then you might as well not exist, right? I'm ready to wipe you from the world. And this was Hiranyakashipu. He was the classic dictator, the classic tyrant, for whom that's all that mattered. And Prahlad, he's not passive. When he's receiving all of this and he's praying to the Lord, and just not even praying, just remembering Krishna, remembering Vishnu, and Krishna's protecting him. Krishna's taking care of him. But the point I want to make is that this is not passive, right? He goes to his father, and if he had taken a sword out and said, okay, you're going to come at me, I'm going to come at you, and let's fight this out, Prahlad would have been participating in the same worldview that his father was. He would have been buying into that worldview. Hiranyakashipu says, Prahlad, you're my enemy. And Prahlad returns and says, Dad, you're mine. You're my enemy too. That's buying into Hiranyakashipu's worldview, even though it's fighting him.
His own point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Prahlad says, no, I'm not going to buy into that. I'm going to say your categorization of this world into friends and enemies, that bifurcation is not true. It's not a good way to live in this world. We have to respond with radical compassion. And that's what Prahlad shows, going back to your point of prayers, right? That's what Prahlad shows in his prayers, is you see that radical compassion where he's telling Nrsinga that, I really care for everyone in this world, including my father. And can you please help him? Can you, even though the world hates him, but I still love him somewhere, and I need you to help him.
Oh, it's so interesting because where the story eventually goes is that Lord Vishnu, after being tortured in so many ways and attempted to be killed, the final confrontation between father and son comes, where his father demands, "Where is this Vishnu that you are so fond of, that you're worshiping? Is he in this pillar?" And Prahlad says, "Yeah, he's everywhere. Yeah, he's in the pillar." And then he goes to smash the pillar, the father, and Lord Vishnu comes out in this most terrifying form, and it's, you could say, the personification, like it's the personification of anger, but like protective, right? That anger that one feels when protecting a loved one that's being unfairly harmed or attacked. And eventually Hiranyakashipu is killed by Krishna appearing in his most ferocious manifestation. And it's so ferocious that even the devas, all the demigods, can barely stand in his presence. Even after Hiranyakashipu's been killed, what they've been waiting for so long, right? What they've been hoping for, would you just please come and kill this person so that we can have peace again? God, why aren't you doing this for us? Now he's dead, but that form is so ferocious that they're terrified to even approach that form. And the only thing that they can think of doing is saying, Prahlad, you're the one that he's come for. You're the so again, there's that Dharmic reversal where Lord Brahma himself, right, like the grandfather, this most important of all the devas, senior and wise, has to turn to a little boy born in a demon family and say, "You please approach the Lord and pacify him." And he offers his prayers. And as you're saying, he's offered any boon that he wants, but consistent with his earlier thoughts is, I don't want anything from you. And perhaps this is part of where Bhagavatam goes further and is deeper, is that although, as you were mentioning, all the different prayers are individual, but there are common themes, and that being that nothing, I don't want anything of this world. As a matter of fact, I don't even want relief from the sufferings of this world. All I really want is to remember you, to serve you, to love you. That's my only interest. And so that those devotional teachings are always highlighted throughout the Bhagavatam's prayers. Yeah. But this question has come up, and it's so important. And I think you're such a qualified person to address it. It's coming from Lisa Tuttle, one of our daily listeners and friends. And she says, I find, let me put my glasses on here a second. I find the text and translations to be very male-centered. It makes me hunger for a female lens. Can you please speak to this in the context of how are we to understand how to make sense of it? Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you for that question, Lisa. This is, I think, just taking a step back from the perspective of history of religions and a professor of religion. This is the reality with religious texts and spiritual texts and just any kind of text across ancient history and across the world. And so the fact that the person speaking or the perspective often comes from a male voice, I think that's not unusual, sadly speaking.
Could I add one thing to that? It seems like it's not only coming from a male voice, but it's being delivered to a male ear as well.
Yes. Thank you. And that's, I think it's to be Yeah, sadly, it's to be expected, I think, because both the speaker and the listener are assumed to be male, and before the contemporary period, this is pretty much the case across the board, with I think not just religious texts, but any kind of major literary productions. You've got this assumed male speaker and male listener, and so I think that in itself is not unusual. I think what the Bhagavatam, what makes it unusual is that it provides voices of women and female heroes in the story that allow us to that we can extract out of the story and tell the story from our perspective, right? So what I mean to say, and this is kind of a theme of my study of the Bhagavatam, is that as readers, we have to find our story in the text. And the Bhagavatam provides plenty of resources for everyone from any walk of life to find their story in the text. Mm. And the act of retelling it from where we stand, that's the act of reading. That's the act of commentary, right? Throughout generations, throughout history, generations of commentators and readers have taken the Bhagavatam, taken this wonderful text, and retold the text, retold the story, and interpreted it to speak to their generation and their times and their personal needs. Mm-hmm. And that's what keeps the text alive. That's what preserves it over time, is when it's deployed and in a new way to speak to new generations. In fact, that's more or less the definition of a classic of literature, is a work that speaks across time and across geography, right? So the Bhagavatam, this is our responsibility as its readers, right? Is to say, number one, if we find something of value in this work, which we do on this audience, really, I think has been steadily studying the Bhagavatam on a daily basis. If we find something of value, then the way to honor it and the way to value it is to tell those stories, to interpret it in a way that speaks to our time, our generation, our communities. And that's how we preserve the text. That's how we honor it. So I want to say this is a concern that has emerged in the last half century, maybe 1 century around the world. That means we have to, the Bhagavatam has the capacity to speak to this concern, but we may need to tell those stories in ways that address those concerns for a modern and postmodern audience. And there's plenty of resources to do that, from the Brahmins' wives to the gopis to the wonderful characters of Kunti and Draupadi. You have these heroes who are women and who are extraordinary, and you have villains who are women, and you've got the full range of characters, and these are deep personalities. They're not unidimensional or two-dimensional cookie cutter women. These are very rich personalities who struggle with difficult husbands, who have a wonderful partner, who have children who are delightful, who have terrible children, right? They are women who are single and not married. There are women who leave relationships. There's like the full range of fighters and leaders. It's all there. But sometimes those voices are buried. They're under the surface, and we kind of have to pull it out and say, oh, here it is. And this story speaks to me. And let me tell this story in a way that highlights this character, right? So we're not inventing, but we're digging, we're mining, we're drawing out. And that's the marker of a classic, is when it allows us to draw out, right? The scholar in University of Chicago, a theologian, Christian theologian named David Tracy, he says, a classic is a text that overflows with meaning, right? It overflows with meaning. You can't contain it in a bottle and put the lid on it and say, here it is. I have explained the Bhagavatam for you, and this is all that's left, right? This is what it is. You've got it all now. No one can ever say that. And this is why after generations, we know something like there are 90 commentaries on the Bhagavatam, right? In Sanskrit, just Sanskrit alone.
Okay.
We don't have all of them. Just to put that in context, most Sanskrit texts get like 3 or 4 commentaries at most, right? So it's a text you can't bottle up. There's always more to say. And I think we may not know Sanskrit today, but we have to act as commentators. We have to speak the text and explain it and understand it in a way that speaks to us and to our generation.
Okay, this is a very interesting answer. And if you don't mind going a few minutes over, because you got us in such an interesting conversation here
I'm happy to,
in response to this question. Thank you. Earlier, we read the story of Sati. Very fascinating character. Wife, yogini, master yogini, to the point where she can, on her own, like self-ignite her own body, right? Like she's uniquely gifted as a yogi, as a yogini. Wife of Lord Shiva, also shown as like the contrast is drawn between herself and her father, Daksha. Daksha, who's representing Orthodox religion, is like, you know, clearly as you can, right? He's everything that is Orthodox, and along with that, what people might expect from the Orthodoxy commonly is a certain type of rigidness or pride, a lack of depth is there in him, which really, I think, speaks to people's concerns with religion today. She can appreciate what he can't appreciate. She sees deeper than he sees. In this particular context, in the character of Shiva, even though externally he appears so unorthodox, she can understand his essence and loves him for that essence. He can't see that essence and resents him for the externals, and the conflict develops. And she's so disgusted with his shallowness and his offensiveness to that which is sacred in Shiva, that she can't bear to even be related to him. And she sits down, goes into a deep yogic trance, and her body goes up in flames, setting off a whole series of chaotic events where Daksha becomes humbled. And so here's another of the Dharmic reversals that you speak about. It was not only the woman who was right, it was the young woman who was right. And it becomes proven, and she becomes glorified. At the same time, as Lisa was mentioning, that comes within a format that seems to cater to the patriarchy. And if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's that yes, the Bhagavatam has been speaking within a format that has been very popular for the past 5,000 years in which it's been existing. It doesn't crush it, but within it comes everything that we need to transcend it, because it's going to be saying to us again and again and again, beyond society's structures, which sometimes have value and sometimes are actually quite harmful. But beyond that are these messages that the higher truth, the highest truth, is that this equality on a spiritual level, and that the highest principle is going to be love. And where we see that, we respect it, we honor it, we glorify it, we hear from it, we become transformed by it, both individually as well as collectively, you know, in terms of socially. And so you're saying, in a sense, if we can, I don't want it, I feel maybe it's not the best way to express it, but in a sense, forgive the context in which it's presented, but be essence seekers and try to really understand what the real message here is. Yeah. That we'll see that message is so consistent with with these social concerns. Maybe, perhaps, maybe it's more clearly articulated and really put on the pedestal that, hey, it doesn't matter man, woman, it doesn't matter young, old, it doesn't matter even species. What is important is the divine love that's existing within the heart of every living being. Let's recognize that and glorify that. And this book is dedicated to doing that, even though it's coming within a format that's traditional or patriarchal even.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, Kaustubha Prabhu. I think that's very well expressed. That the Bhagavatam doesn't explode the structures. It doesn't demolish them, burn them up. The social structures within which the many generations of people that the Bhagavatam describes. It describes a span of thousands of years of history, right? That the Bhagavatam is not exploding those structures and demolishing them altogether, but rather recognizing that at any point in history, we are going to have hierarchical social structures and the status quo that are often, problematic and exploitative in nature, right? So it's starting with that recognition and saying, this is how society has worked for centuries, but here is the way to transcend that. Here is the way to reverse that. Here's the way to go beyond that. And that's through the power of bhakti, right? That bhakti transcends, it goes beyond all. And that's where we sometimes need to read beyond or read deeper within, right? Outside you can find passages in the Bhagavatam where the Brahmins, the upper caste, are praised on and on and on and on, right? That's there, and where men are there above women, and children are told to always be submissive to their parents, etc. You can find passages like that. That's not out of the question. But then soon after, right? That's the basic structure. Soon after that, you dig inside, you pull that apart, and you realize what the Bhagavatam is saying is that despite whatever structures of authority or hierarchy we may find ourselves in, and the structures back then and the structures today are going to be different, right? So for someone reading in India 500 years ago, that discussion of caste hierarchy would have been just as painful as gender hierarchy is for us today.
Sure. Okay.
Right? It would have been exactly the same thing. And they would have been largely oblivious to the gender hierarchy, but they would have been very sensitive to the caste hierarchy there, right? So the problematic structures change, but the message of the Bhagavatam throughout those structures is consistent. Open that up and look within. And when you look within, you find that here is the pathway to transcend, to go beyond through the power of bhakti, that bhakti takes precedence over it all, over caste and over gender and over age and all of those things.
Prabhu, thank you so much for that answer. In one sense, I feel very benefited from it. And in another sense, I feel like it's almost just the beginning of something that we all need to dig deeper into and understand deeper. I think we need to formally invite you to come back again. I really appreciate having you here today. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface of so much that you have to offer. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It was a real pleasure. So happy to be here. Such a great conversation. I love spending my morning with you today. Thank you.
Okay. Now, normally at this point, we would have Mara here. I don't know if Mara's still with us, though, and we would drop in on so many of our listeners and say hello to them. But as she's not here, I'm just going to thank you all for being here this morning and announce to you that we will be on at a different time, well, the same time as today, but a different time than normal tomorrow. We'll be on not at 6 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow, but we'll be on again at 8 a.m. Eastern time. So please join us then. Radhika Ramana Prabhu, we're deeply grateful, and we look forward to bringing you back again sometime before too long. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's a beautiful day for a beautiful day. And as Raghunath would say, let the magic flow. See you soon. Hare Krishna.